Greetings and welcome. My name is Daniel Lazar, coming to you from Kreuzberg, the heart and, dare I say, the soul of Berlin, Germany. It's my humble honor and my pleasure to be here with you and to support you in your pursuit of understanding United States history and all of its complexities. Today's talk is going to be about the Great Depression. I'm calling this talk Hard Times in the Great Depression, Challenges to American Ambition. The nature of the title, I hope, will become increasingly clear to you as the talk goes on. I'm going to be talking first about the numbers. I'm going to give you a bit of an autopsy report of the 1920s, give you a sense of the shape and the contours of the Great Depression. Then we'll talk about how the American people, at their best, came together to support each other despite or because of the hard times. We'll then talk about natural and man-made disasters in the 1930s. Please note the quotes on natural disasters. And we'll also talk about the exodus of 2.5 million Americans from the Great Plains to the West, having profound consequences for American life for decades to come. We'll then talk about the tragedy and the ordeal of Herbert Hoover, who paid the ultimate price, if you will, in the 1932 election, which, spoiler alert, he lost rather magnificently. It's important as well for us to talk about what we're not going to cover in this lecture. We're not going to talk about the market crash. We're not going to talk about the rise and the fall of the American stock market and the collapse of global trade. We are not going to talk about the politics, in particular, of the 1920s. We're not going to talk about the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administrations, 3, by most accounts, rather failed presidencies. And we're not going to talk about the New Deal. We're not going to talk about Franklin Roosevelt's ambitious and robust sets of reforms to clean up the mess of the Great Depression. Those are all interesting, terribly interesting, in fact, so much so that they will be part of other talks and other lessons that we will have together. All right. So let's talk about the numbers. Now, I should say, before we dig too deep in the numbers, and we won't take too deep of a dive, but we are going to talk about the numbers. I don't want you to feel like you have to swim untethered in a pool of data. I'm going to share with you these numbers, and I don't want you to commit this data to memory or even to try to do so. I just want to give you a sense of the calamity of the Depression. I want to give you a sense of how bad the financial and economic markets were. And I should say, before I forget, that this lecture and, of course, all of my lectures will be available to you at www.daniellazar.com. And so if you want some of this data to reflect on for whatever purpose later, it's yours for free. Don't worry about it. Let's get into the numbers. Now, pardon me for just a moment. I want to get out my laser pointer. All right. So this is the Dow Jones Industrial Average from 1920 to 1940. And we see the so-called roaring 20s. The stock market goes from about 75 in 1921 to 375 in 1929. So we have, a fourfold increase in American stocks with a peak at 381. And then this is Black Thursday, October 1929. And this is the virtual free fall, bringing American stocks down even below where they were in 1921, just 2 years after World War I. Now, it's important here that I pause to offer you what I think is an important lesson in differentiating between the financial markets and the economy more broadly. Yeah. Financial markets, particularly the Dow Jones Industrial Average, is a speculation about the health of financial markets and industrial markets. The Dow Jones doesn't say so much about the health of an economy. There are the markets, and then there's the economy. And they don't correlate particularly well. And certainly one doesn't cause the other. A good market doesn't cause a good economy, and a good economy doesn't necessarily cause good markets, although the latter is more likely than the former. You see this today. I'm recording in in April of 2020, and the stock market's humming along rather splendidly. And amidst the COVID crisis, the American economy is on ice. The global economy is on ice. It is, others would use the metaphor, on life support. The economies today are doing terribly. Markets are doing pretty well. If you got money in the market, you might be worried, but you're probably doing pretty well. So the market itself is not necessarily the cause of the economic tumble. Yeah, it's worth differentiating between the two. The fall of the stock market was the canary in the coal mine, if you will. All right. So let's talk about some other indicators. The Dow is, to some degree, not to a very good degree, as I said, an indicator of economic health, but it's one indicator. A more common indicator, still imperfect, is GDP, gross domestic product. Now, you might know that the gross domestic product is the total output of goods and services in an economy. Yeah. GDP is almost always used as one of the measures of the health of an economy. Here we see in 1929, the US GDP was something like 850 billion. And by 1933, the American economy had been cut by a third. So a third of the output of goods and services in the United States economy were slashed. Now, GDP, I said it was an imperfect measure of the economy. It's imperfect in part because the gross domestic product doesn't say anything about purchasing power. We have another measure of purchasing power called PPP, or purchasing power parity. It doesn't say anything about the price of goods, the price of services. It doesn't say anything about the price of rents. It doesn't say anything about wages. It doesn't say anything, GDP doesn't say anything about inequality. It just talks about what's being produced. It doesn't talk about how it's being distributed, how people are living. But GDP it's not to poo-poo GDP. It's to give you a sense of the limitation of the measure. So let's look at some other measures. Again, just trying to get a sense of the contours of the economic collapse. This is the unemployment graph from 1925 to 1945. Now, allow me to give you some of the limitations of unemployment data. Unemployment measures the percentage of people who have actively sought work over the course of the last month. So it doesn't take into account children. Yeah. It doesn't take into account people in the modern era over 65 years old. It doesn't take into account stay-at-home parents who aren't seeking work. We don't want to count a father who chooses to stay at home and watch his 7 kids as unemployed because it's his choice. Yeah. Um, right. Unless that father, of course, wasn't really choosing to stay at home, he was just unemployed, despite looking for work actively. It doesn't take into account people who are disabled. There's, of course, a broad range of disabilities. These are people who are looking for work. They really want to work. They've been trying actively. You get the point, right? So when we talk about unemployment under 5%, that's virtually no unemployment. Yeah. The 1920s offered fantastic employment opportunities, so much so that women were invited into the workforce in unprecedented, though terribly imperfect ways. The unemployment rate went from about 3% in 1929 to just shy of 25% by the nadir of the Great Depression in 1933. And America, until 1941, when America was brought into World War II, the American unemployment rate almost never dipped below 15%. So that's hard, right? This is a very stressful time for people, particularly people who have families that they need to support. This is the nature of a depression, right? You have real high unemployment rates. Now, here are some images of unemployment lines. This photo on the left is interesting for a couple reasons. First, it's striking to me that people who were unemployed, and in some cases so desperately unemployed, they queued in a rather orderly fashion. It seems that it's early in the morning. You see, or very late in the evening, but you see the sun casting its shadows. My guess is it's early in the morning. And so people are, they're not begging and barking and fighting and kicking and screaming for work. They're sitting down and they're being hopeful. They're probably talking to the person next to them, which is remarkable. It's also remarkable, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see this in this particular photo, in this particular medium. It's a racially integrated line, which was not particularly common throughout America at the time. The photo on the right here is fascinating for perhaps the opposite reason, although not entirely. I think the photo shows a certain complicated contradiction, which I find some interest in. It's really chaotic, and the people in the front are being crushed like it's a late 70s, early 80s punk concert. And it seems like a terribly frustrating situation in which to find oneself. But you see a lot of people smiling in the photo. I'm not sure if you can see that. Perhaps there's a lot of work to go around that day, and those are the people who are optimistic. Perhaps it's just because the camera is there and they know it. But people went to unemployment offices often every day with hope to try to get some work. And I imagine that some days and weeks were better than others. Now, let's say that those people in this photo right here managed to land a job. Well, even the people who got jobs were not making the wages that they had made prior to the market crash. We see here that in 1928, the average manufacturing job, so we're not talking about farmers, we're not talking about sales clerks, we're not talking about retail workers, we're talking about just people in manufacturing. Again, just to give you a sense of part of the economy. Industrial workers made on average $28 a week in 1928, and by 1933, 32 to 33, that number had slipped down to the $17 a week range. So why do I show you this number? This particular data set. even if one had the good fortune to be employed, they're making substantially less than they were during the Roaring 20s. In the 1930s, that worker's rent didn't decrease. The amount of food his or her children needed to eat did not decrease. His car payments, if he was lucky enough to have a car, did not decrease. Any loans, be they low interest or high interest loans that he took out in the 20s in order to buy a radio or to buy a home, the mortgages and the loans didn't go down. So even people who were gainfully employed were still finding themselves having their goods confiscated, having their homes foreclosed on, and if not, they were living with the constant stress that was going to happen to them. And that's something maybe I should pause on a little bit. There is the financial stress, which we talked about, and then there's the economic stresses that we talk about. But it's important to try to add to this mess, if you will, the psychological stresses, the psychological burden of debt. Okay. So weekly earnings went down. This, again, is just in manufacturing. We'll talk later about the impact of the Depression on farmers. You would be hard-pressed to find a field in which wages or salaries were rising in the 1930s. Now, let's imagine, if you will, in the 1920s, you did all the right things, yeah? You bought a home, you didn't rent, yeah? You paid your taxes, you tithed, and you put 10% away into a bank, right? 10% for Uncle Sam, 10% to the religious organization of your choice, and 10% in the bank. You didn't go out and blow your money on an automobile. You didn't go to the movies 2 times a week like most Americans did, even though those only cost 5 cents. You didn't waste any money. You were conscientious. And you know what? Let's say you didn't even throw your money in the stock market. Let's say you were one of those people who had disposable income, but were wise enough not to dump it all into the stock market. Yeah? Imagine that person. They put their money in the banks. Well, unlike today, banks weren't insured. The banks invested in the markets, and the banks went bankrupt. In 1929, the year of the infamous crash, 659 banks went bankrupt. In 1930, and up and up and up. In 1933, again, the nadir of the Depression, the worst year of the Depression, 4,004 banks just folded. So in the 5-year period, you had 9,800 banks that just went bankrupt with a total of $7 billion, $7.1 billion of the money of regular, hardworking, decent American citizens. Now, in the end of 1933, Franklin Roosevelt established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That's the FDIC right here. And in a later talk, in another lesson, we will walk you through what the FDIC is and how it helped Americans to reestablish their faith in the banks. What we have here on the right is an image of American Union Bank in Manhattan, and people lining up desperately to get their savings. Most people didn't get their savings. Yeah. There's some interesting oral histories, which I'll talk about in a second, of what it was like to be there, standing in line, waiting to see if the bank teller would tell you that like you had something left. Most people, this is to me the most interesting and like daunting and sad part, most people in the heart of hearts, they knew that there was nothing left in their account. But they would wait in line the whole day just to have the bank teller say it to their face. So in addition to the banking collapse, there was a collapse in global trade. Now, I should say that the United States instituted some pretty, you might say robust, you might say regressive tariffs in the 1920s. The strongest of them was the Hawley-Smoot tariff, 1928. And so global trade was already challenged going into the Great Depression. This is 1929, again, the year of the market crash. American exports and imports declined precipitously. And I would be remiss in not saying here that the decline in global trade was a symptom of rising international tensions, but it also caused, and to this day will continue to cause, rising international tensions. And in the event that you're not reading between the lines on this, I often like to say, when we're all in bed together, nobody wants to light the bed on fire. When we're all trading with each other, and in the modern era, we'll talk about the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Mexico, U.S. and her European allies. When we're all trading with each other, we're less likely to declare war on each other. Trade creates for a basis for dialogue. And when we're in dialogue with each other, we're less likely to be fighting, right? Talking is the opposite in a way of fighting from a diplomatic perspective. It's hard to talk when you're fighting. Yeah, it's hard to fight when you're talking. So the precipitous decline in imports and exports was a symptom and a cause of rising tensions. And of course, it's around the corner, coming up here in 1939, 1940. And of course, World War II did increase trade between the United States and her allies in the war. And of course, that brought America into the war itself. Right. So again, I don't want you to sweat these numbers too hard. I want you to take the key lessons, whatever you deem the key lessons of this data to be. And I want to also share with you another, I think, key lesson. There's this myth about the 1930s that people stopped having kids, that people just died early, and that the suicide rate went through the roof. And that's mostly untrue. Now, it is true that the fertility rate declined from 1928 to 35. And it declined rather drastically. A 20% decline in fertility is hardly a laughing matter. Why did the fertility rate decline? Think it through. What would have been the factors? Women are having less children. Well, I think maybe the first thing that comes to your mind is that people were scared, they were nervous, they were uncertain about the future. In fact, just last night I was talking to a buddy of mine. He and his partner, they were thinking about having a second kid. They've been thinking about it for some time. It's something that he and I have been talking about for a couple of years. Just last night is like, we can't do it. The nature of his job and his husband's job, they just, both of them feel really unstable. They're not sure if their jobs will be there in a week or a month or a year. they're concerned about their economic future, and they don't want to add to that stress. They decided to not have another kid, not adopt a second kid. The same was probably true of people in the 1930s. Yeah, it's also the case, unlike today, for the foreseeable future. Let's hope that the fertility rate went down because while Americans didn't really go hungry in the Great Depression, other countries, people were more likely to go hungry. Americans didn't go hungry in mass. There was a shortage of nutritious food available to a lot of Americans. To get pregnant and to sustain a pregnancy requires copious amounts of nutrition. I was always shocked at how much my wife ate, and to be honest, how well she ate when she was pregnant. It was hard to do that for a lot of women in the 1930s. Yeah, they had food, they had bread, they had soup, they had 3% beer, healthier than water. Again, the subject of another lecture, but not often, not always enough nourishment to sustain a pregnancy. And then the last key factor that I'm aware of that explains the decline in the fertility rate is that a lot of men had to take off. A lot of husbands and fathers had to take off, leave the homestead to go find work, to work at the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, or one of the other New Deal agencies. They left home, and so they weren't there to make babies. So the fertility rate did decline. It goes back up again in 1935, and of course, 1945 is the baby boom, and that solves that problem, and then some. In researching for this lecture, I found what I will call a fun fact. Life expectancy, contrary to what you would probably expect, rose from 57 years old in 1929 to 63 years in 1932, a 5-year increase in life expectancy. Yeah. Substantial. Why? Why did life expectancy rise at the height of the Depression? Done trying? I discovered this University of Michigan study that offers a number of factors in trying to explain this phenomenon, two of which stood out as the most important, and I wonder if you guessed it. Well, if you're not at work in the factory, you're not going to die on the factory floor. A lot of Americans had very dangerous jobs, and one of the perks of unemployment is you're not going to die on the job. And the second one, drum roll or something, is that fewer Americans drove cars. And cars in the 1920s were death traps, no seatbelts. A lot of them didn't have windshields. There was no proper signage on the streets. Driving was a risk to you and everyone around you. So life expectancy actually went up. Who knew? A couple smart people at the University of Michigan, evidently. And then on a darker note, but actually not as dark as it looks, I distinctly recall in my U.S. history class in high school talking about how suicides went through the roof. All of these Americans who had invested all of their money in the stock market were so ashamed that they were dupes, that they were suckers, that they just found the highest ledge and that was the end of them. That's not the case. Now, between 1920 and 28, 12 out of 100,000 people died by suicide. Very low. In 1929, that number popped. And precipitously so, right? We're seeing a 30% increase in suicides. And that's sad and it's awful. And it goes back to normal after 1929. I'd also like to say a couple more things about suicide, if I may be so bold. Trigger warning, insert that. First, human beings are remarkably resilient. It's very much against our nature to kill ourselves. When suicide rates do spike, it requires a whole community's attention to try to make sense of it, because it's self-preservation is our most basic instinct. And when we defy that instinct, it requires all stakeholders to get together to make sense of it and to solve it. Second, there is almost no correlation. At best, there's a spurious correlation between economic well-being and suicide. Poverty doesn't cause suicide. Economic anxiety doesn't even cause suicide. Unemployment doesn't cause suicide. It causes stress. It causes anxiety. Unemployment causes anxiety, but not suicide. Suicide's a more multidisciplinary problem than economics or finance. And it's with that I want to make perhaps the most, I think, interesting remark of this lecture. So it's all kind of downhill from here, maybe. In the English language, we are saddled with the word depression that seems to mean three very different things. The first is a clinical psychology term referring to a psychological instability, a sickness, if you will, though I'm not totally comfortable with that. So there's psychological depression. And we have the same word for, like, I'm sad. Oh, I'm so depressed. John Prine died the other day. I'm so depressed. Not depressed. You're sad. It's grief. Grief, depression, two totally different things. Grief is a feeling, usually temporary. Depression is a psychological imbalance. It's a chemical imbalance. And then there's this third definition of depression that has to do with the economy. So one is about economics, right? And then one is about somehow our feelings. And it's really important for me that you do everything you can to wrap your minds around the problem that depression A, your feelings, and depression B, the economy, are two totally different things for which we need two totally different words. And the reason that that's so important for me to impress upon you is because if you are lucky, you will see 2 or 3 depressions in your lifetime. There's a lot of forecasting that we are going to see one now. The last major economic shock was 2007, 2008. It lasted a couple of years. In some countries, it lasted until now. And if you're lucky, you're going to live to be 100, and you're going to see a handful of depressions. And I want you to know that in your long lives, when the markets crash, you don't have to crash with the markets. You can be alive and robust and, frankly, the best version of yourself despite the markets, despite the economy. Okay. So with that in mind, it is my pleasure to introduce you to my friend Studs, because he's the one who taught me that lesson. Studs Terkel is a Chicago guy. I'm a Chicago guy. He's of Russian Jewish ancestry. Okay. He's a radio guy. I'm a radio guy. And I grew up in Chicago with Studs Terkel on my radar. Yeah. And Studs Terkel, this is him broadcasting in the Chicago radio station. I don't need that. And this is a book of his, probably his most revered work. It's called Hard Times. It's an oral history of the Great Depression. I read this book when I was 20 maybe. And I went into it thinking, like, I never wanted to read a book about the Depression because the Depression is so depressing. Why would I want to read about the Depression? I'll read about wars, right? But I don't want to read about depression. This is the most inspiring book. The stories of how people came together and took care of each other and found themselves and found each other and found community. Not just despite the Depression, but because of it. So this is my big plug for Studs Terkel. The Depression wasn't depressing. When the Depression comes for you, don't think you're going to be depressed. Also, read Studs Terkel. Listen to Studs Terkel. There's a Studs Terkel archive online. This book is available for free online. I think it's public record now. That's what his trust allowed for, which is awesome. Love you, Studs. Rest in peace. Now, to illustrate some of that, here is an image. I don't know where this is from. It's a famous image of a food line. For the unemployed, sandwiches and beer. My kind of lunch. People are lining up. People are taking care of each other. You hungry? Come here. You can come to the church. You can come to Al Capone's place on the South State Street in Chicago. The Capone Mafia, Al Capone at this point was trying to improve his reputation, which was on the fritz, ultimately landing him in the pokey. This is actually a photo of the outside and the inside of Al Capone's soup kitchen. Even the mafiosos were taking care of the neighborhood people. It says something. I don't know what, but it says something. And here is a Dorthea Lange photo. Dorthea Lange is going to be heretofore a fixture of this lecture. And this is a famous image of hers, not her most famous image. I'll show you her most famous image. You've probably seen it. This is from a Breadline. There was this a nun who ran this bread and soup line, and they called her the White Angel. And this is an image of that Breadline in 1933 at the peak of the Depression. Remarkable, of course, because of the one guy who's facing away from the crowd, catching a breath, dealing with the pain of it all. It's a great photo. Okay, so now where are we? We're 40 minutes into this thing. If you're still with me, this would be a reasonable place to take a pause. Should you like a pause? It's up to you if you want to pause or not. You don't have to. The bell would ring in class right now. All right. Okay. So as if everything you heard wasn't problematic enough, in the early mid-1930s, 1935, having nothing to do with the financial markets, the Great Plains here, the epicenter is the red, the most severe erosion out. You had one of the greatest man-made disasters in modern history, known as the Great Dustbowl. The land, they said, the land dried up. What ultimately happened is all of those farmers who got homesteads because of the 1862 Homestead Act and other Homestead Acts thereafter, they went out west, many of them with very little or no farming experience. They tilled the soil, 3 or 4 inches. They didn't really dig deep. They didn't have time to. They didn't have the tools to. They were hungry. They needed to get the crops going. And they didn't properly use that soil. And that happened. The Great Dust Storm, that's coming over Strafford, Texas. Famous and famously daunting photo. That's the before photo of Elkhart, Kansas in 1937. It's a couple of years of this. That's your after picture. The land dried up. There's no farming that. There's no planting that. That, my friends, is a family tragedy of epic proportions. Here's a family checking out what's left. The answer is not much. Not much, very sadly. So what are these people going to do? They're going to hop the next train to the cities to compete for work that doesn't exist, and the work that does exist won't afford even the most humble of apartments. Well, they had to give up their land. This is farm foreclosures from 1929 to 45. It is notable here that if you look on the y-axis, 1929, that you had 20,000 farms being foreclosed on when times were good in 1929. And then you had 50,000 farms, 52,000 farms foreclosed on in 1933 alone. So people, they took out loans from banks. The banks, because the banks were folding, had to call in those loans. Farmers couldn't pay them. The bank took the property. And where that didn't happen, a lot of people, they just had to run from their farms because of the Great Dustbowl. So you have this, the Great Depression is great in part because it affects the rural landscape. It affects the urban landscape. It's quite great. It's a Great Depression. By the way, I should note that the Panic of 1873 was called the Great Depression until the Panic of 1893, which was then called the Great Depression. And now we have one Great Depression, and that's the 1929 to 1941 Depression. So thought I would mention that. So people take off. 2.5 million Americans, they flee the Great Plains. They go to California. These are 2 Dorthea Lange photos in 1936 and 1937, respectively. And they both speak for themselves. They're also both perfect photos. I'd love to see them displayed well, not on my screen. But in any event, here are 2 more splendid photos, and not Dorthea Lange photos. These people were called Okies and Arkies. On the left are people from Oklahoma. On the right are people from Arkansas. It was a term of endearment in some circles and a term of derision in others. People from Oklahoma and Arkansas, the epicenter of the Great Dustbowl, they packed up everything they could, whether it was the previous picture, and put it on their backpacks, in their bags rather, or they put it in their cars, and they would set up camp going west, going to California so that they could become migrant workers. And along the way, so this is the opposite of the Breadline picture, right? The photo on the left says, jobless men keep going. We can't even afford to take care of our own. It's rude. It's also probably honest. So you have to understand the Great Depression, you have to be able to kind of carry 2 thoughts at the same time, which, might just be the definition of intelligence, right? You have to take that image of the bread lines and the soup kitchens and people doing everything they can to help each other. And you read Studs Terkel's book and you're going to hear 1,000 stories of people taking care of each other. And then there's the opposite of people like, you're not welcome here, get out. So both are true. This the problem of depression is large, right? It contains multitudes. It defies simple understanding. But American people, American families, in particular American men, they went out on the road. And this notion of the road, this intellectual and in some ways poetic construct of the road becomes central to what it means to be an American thereafter. Now, I grew up having a certain fetish for the road. My dad loved the road. My dad, to this day, he loves driving. Right now, he's in a position where he can't drive. All he wants in the world right now, I kid you not, all my father wants in the world, as much as anything at least, is to get back on the road. Yeah, it's quintessential to what it means to be an American. Right now, my brother has the keys to his car. We won't let him drive. There's good reasons for that. But the road, man, being on the road is at the very core of what it means to be American. And I want to illustrate that point by going into some of my favorite things, but not taking too deep a dive. On the left, you see Woody Guthrie. His guitar, if you can't read it, says, "This machine," this guitar, "kills fascists." He's perhaps the greatest American folk singer of all time. And here he is. Yeah. Now, Woody Guthrie, right next to Bob Dylan. Two separate photos put next to each other. Bob Dylan would be the first to tell you he spent most of his early years in music, and one might say he spent all of his years in music just trying to do what Woody Guthrie did. What did Woody Guthrie do? Woody Guthrie gave a voice to the songs of Okies and Arkies and people from Texarkana on the road. These were in my humble opinion, the first true and truly accessible American songs. This land is your land. This land is my land. That's from this time. Woody Guthrie was a socialist, and it was wrapped up in Workers' International notions. But the idea of the road, the intellectual construct, the poetic construct of the road that was spoken to with such dignity by the likes of Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan. And then 2 weeks ago, John Prine, who's in the bottom of the middle, he died of COVID. Such a beautiful guy. And he was, in his early 70s. And he himself was trying to he was in dialogue with the great folk artists, the guitar slingers, on the road, escaping the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Those songs and that artistic aesthetic and that promise of the road and the problems of the road is what inspired Jack Kerouac to write On the Road. And the whole Kerouac phenomenon in the 50s and 60s, and what inspired the counterculture movement and the hippie movement, and what created space for rock and roll in America, is all the roots of that all go back to the Depression and the Okies and Arkies and jumping on trains, and it's beautiful, man. It's a beautiful time, and I say that to say this: it's not depressing. American folk music from the Great Depression is the antithesis of depression. It's inspiring, and they knew it. There were hard times, but there were times with purpose, and there were times where people came together, and there was hope. Not always, I don't want to glorify the Depression, but I want to add nuance to it. That's my job. That's what they pay me for. Not much. They don't pay me much, don't worry, but all right. So just a thought about the road, a little meditation on the road. And they ultimately became migrant farmers. They stayed on the road. 2 Dorthea Lange photos. Dorthea Lange, she was educated out east. She went to Columbia University, studied photography, ended up marrying an academic who went out and taught it in California, landed at UC Berkeley. And he is an economist, and she is a photographer, spent the better part of the 30s traversing California and taking photos of Okies and Arkies who made their way to California, rarely to settle down, often to just go from Southern to Northern California whenever the season was right for picking walnuts or avocados. Or splendid photos. And that's the one we all know, right? Migrant Mother, 1936. She looked so resolute and so concerned at the same time. Oh. Well, maybe you've seen it before. There's another photo that has some legs to it too. So I had alluded in the introduction to this lecture that the Dust Bowl was a natural disaster. It wasn't natural; it was man-made, right? It resulted from decades of destroying precious, beautiful American land. The Ohio River had flooded well before that part of America was peopled, as they say. But the floods got worse and worse as Americans failed to tend to that land. When the Louisville flood, which was part of the larger Ohio River flood, which I don't know if you've heard about the Great Ohio Flood of 1935 to 1937, but it displaced 2 million people. Like a million and a half people lost their homes, like forever. It was quite remarkable. Well, Louisville, Kentucky, then and now, is home to a vibrant and beautiful African-American community. And this is an image of African-Americans standing in a breadline right in front of this billboard, a billboard left over from the 1920s. Yeah. It's all just a bit too much, isn't it? So you have 2 so-called natural disasters in the 1930s that are that add to the complexity of the decade and to the Depression. These are some man-made solutions. Herbert Hoover took office in 1929. Hoover is a fascinating character in American history. He's a tragic character in American history. And this is the last part of my talk today. Hoover, I called these slides the Ordeal of Herbert Hoover because in 1958, Hoover, in his later years, decided to become an historian. He's one of only 2 presidents who's written about previous presidents, and he couldn't help but write a story of his friend and his former boss, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat who occupied the Oval Office from 1913 to 21. And he called that book The Ordeal and Tragedy of Woodrow Wilson. So I want to talk about the ordeal of Herbert Hoover, who is really a magnificent human being. truly accomplished. He was born in very humble origins. He grew up a Quaker in Iowa, and he was orphaned at age 10. So we're talking about a guy who grew up not poor, but humble, but became very poor, so much so that he was an orphan at age 10. He ended up, despite having failed, I think, all but one of his entrance exams, getting into Stanford University. Stanford, by the way, he was in the inaugural class of Stanford. Stanford wasn't this august academic body. It was a new, red brick school. But he ended up going to Stanford, becoming studying geology, and becoming what they called the great engineer. Traveled the world, went to China, made literally millions of dollars, which was a lot of money then. It's a lot of money now. It's a ton of money then. And he became, an American rags to riches story. And his mind was revered. He was a great problem solver. And for that reason, Woodrow Wilson, who was a professor of politics at Princeton University in his earlier years, was aware of Herbert Hoover and hired him to help to lead the U.S. relief effort for the American allies in World War I. Did a splendid job of that by all accounts, so much so that he kept his commitment to public service and enjoyed being the Secretary of Commerce under both Warren G. Harding and Cal Coolidge. He was infinitely greater than the two of them combined. I do wonder if he knew that. And there are some indications about that, but we won't go into that. He became president in March of 1929. Right? Herbert Hoover didn't cause the crash. Herbert Hoover stepped into office, probably looked at the papers on his desk and was like, this is going to be a problem. I don't know the extent to which that's true. But it is certainly true that he didn't cause the crash. But for the crash having happened on his watch, and more importantly, for his failure to truly respond to the crash in a robust and fully fledged way, Herbert Hoover does not get ranked particularly well among American historians. His current rank is number 36 in an aggregate of different historians. These are historians from the left and the right. It's an aggregate of different polls of hundreds, if not thousands, of historians. And he's 36 out of 45. So he's at the top of the bottom quartile of American presidents. Great man. Not a great president. He had his limitations. We all do. And when he took the hardest job in the world, he wasn't able to overcome some of those limitations. And part of that is because of his rags to riches story. Herbert Hoover, to his credit, did not see himself as anything particularly special. And he thought if he could go from being an orphaned Quaker to a millionaire and the president of the United States, that anyone could. And the government didn't do anything for him. So why should the federal government do anything for these people who are suffering in the Depression? Now, that might sound harsh or regressive to you, but to most Americans in the 1930s, that's a common thought. Nobody expected the federal government to intercede. The 1920s and 30s were an era where the federal government was surprisingly small. The federal government hardly took taxes from the American people. The American people didn't give the government much, and they didn't expect much in return from the federal government. For Hoover to help in the way that FDR helped, he would not only have had to totally reimagine his autobiography, he would have to fundamentally change his philosophy of governance. He and most Americans did not expect direct relief from the federal government. And Herbert Hoover was not a radical. Herbert Hoover was not a revolutionary. Herbert Hoover was pretty consistent with the norms of the American people. And in this way, Herbert Hoover wasn't a great leader. And this is why he doesn't get ranked particularly well. The American people came to blame Hoover, and they, in what I think is sort of a clever, although I don't know if he deserved this, but these encampments of impoverished people became known not affectionately as Hoovervilles. This is Central Park in 1933. By the way, Central Park wasn't always the jewel in the crown of New York City. It was more like the toilet of New York City, if that photo is any indication. And on the right, we have a Hooverville in Seattle. These are families living in these makeshift shacks. Seem to have a family of 4 or so on the left, and the ideal family of 2 on the right. This is a Dorthea Lange photo of a Hooverville. On the left, we have one of these Hoovervilles and transmogrified into what became the Bonus Army. By the end of 1932, by the end of Hoover's first year in office, the American people had grown impatient, and they wanted more from the government, but they didn't feel they had the right to ask for it. However, the Americans who put on uniforms and strapped on boots and went out to Europe to fight in a war that most of them didn't really have much interest in or a desire to fight in, these people were promised, the American veterans of World War I were promised bonuses. The federal government failed to deliver those bonuses because the federal government didn't have the money to do so. And so we see on the right an invitation to both black and white veterans alike to, at the opening of Congress on December 5th of 1932, demand that Congress create funds to pay these veterans their bonuses. They stayed for a couple days. Hoover called out the DC police and later the National Guard. And Douglas MacArthur, the great World War I and World War II and Korean War hero, by some counts at least, MacArthur's 12th Infantry beat and gassed these veterans, killing 2, as well as a 12-week-old baby who died in the hospital from poison gas. This is, I should duly note, the exception to the rule of the American Code of Conduct during the Great Depression. Most Americans didn't go to war with authorities. But these soldiers who were trained to fight and who felt that they had earned the right to their bonuses, they did fight, as they were trained to do, for what they thought was right, as they were told to do. And they paid the price. 2 of them paid the ultimate price. Hoover paid what I call the ultimate price, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to share a little bit about the ordeal and tragedy, if you will, of Herbert Hoover. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1920 said that he, Herbert Hoover, is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him president of the United States. There couldn't be a better one. He was wrong. Most American presidents were better than Herbert Hoover. In fact, FDR was by most, I think all accounts, let's say most accounts, much better a president than Herbert Hoover. When Hoover received and accepted the nomination to the Republican Party ticket in 1928 at his alma mater, Stanford University, he said, and I quote, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us." Ew, not so much. Bad call. Pretty wrong. The tragedy of Herbert Hoover. In his State of the Union address, his first State of the Union, in December of 1929, he said, and I quote, "I, Herbert Hoover, have instituted systematic, voluntary measures of cooperation with the business institutions and with state and municipal authorities to make certain that the fundamental business of the country shall continue as usual, that wages and therefore consuming power shall not be reduced." Okay, so this is only 3 months after the crash. He doesn't know how bad it's going to get. Going into the, Christmas and New Year holiday, he wants to try to, stoke the markets a little bit. But this is the tragedy of Herbert Hoover. This notion that business is going to remain as usual is wrong. He was very wrong. And he was wrong because he was limited in his ability to think critically about the problem, to see it for what it was. Not saying I would have done better. And then, in speaking to the Chamber of Commerce in May of 1930, and again, consider the audience. He is speaking to the Chamber of Commerce, and maybe he was just there to chairlead for the commercial enterprises of the United States, though I'm not sure that's the job of the president. He said, "While the crash only took place 6 months ago, I am convinced we have now passed the worst, and with continued unity of effort, we shall rapidly recover." He was terribly wrong. All of the accounts of Herbert Hoover to which I've been exposed indicate that he was not being disingenuous here. Herbert Hoover believed that if the American people just, hold on to their seats and stay resolute, the country will, through cooperation and patience, be able to pull itself up by its bootstraps. That the federal government won't need to provide jobs or to provide direct relief. And not for a lack of intellect or for a lack of belief in public service or for any character flaw per se. He couldn't, in his right mind, devise robust enough solutions within what he believed were the parameters of the Constitution. There's what is right, and there's what is moral, and there's what is legal. And Herbert Hoover, like all great presidents, believed in the rule of law. He believed that the Constitution and the precedents that the Constitution has set and that American code law has set has to, at all times, take precedence. The federal government, the Constitution doesn't establish a federal government that could cut checks to Americans because they can't afford to stay in their apartments or their houses. The federal government is not meant to be the greatest employer, the largest employer in America, which it is today by far. This is unfathomable to Herbert Hoover. He, in his way, was a Jeffersonian. He believed And this is the challenge. So if I'm going to talk about the ordeal and tragedy of Herbert Hoover, let's talk about an honest intellectual challenge that Herbert Hoover should pose to us. He doesn't believe that the federal government should have that much power because he believed that state and local government should have that much power, and that where state and local governments do not have that power, that the people and their civic organizations should. Because he believes, and you might see where I'm going with this, that if someone were to inhabit the Oval Office who was not suited to the job, that the American people could not expect from that person the ability to solve their problems. So you keep the government small, the federal government small, because the federal government cannot be reached by most Americans. Most Americans can go to their mayor's office and make demands. They can, within reason, drive to their state houses and make demands. Getting to DC is a tall order. So, as they used to say, you never keep the nexus of political power out of arm's reach of the American people. This is the Jeffersonian vision. This is Hoover's vision. It's not that he was trying to abnegate responsibility. He just did not see the federal government's responsibility the same way that Franklin Roosevelt and every president since Franklin Roosevelt saw the role of the federal government. And for that, he paid the price. The map on the left here has the electoral map of 1932. All of the purple states voted Republican in 1928 in favor of Herbert Hoover, and then switched in 1932 to vote for FDR. Yeah. And then, I should move myself here. This is the electoral map of 1932. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, won in a total landslide, one of the greatest landslides in American history. 472 to 59, and the Electoral College won 57% of the popular vote. And this is Inauguration Day, 4th of March, 1933. Hoover on the left, handing power over to FDR on the right. The looks on their faces speak volumes. Hoover looks defeated. He's probably relieved. He's been relieved of the hardest job in the world. FDR looks resolute. I mean, you could see him looking into the future. And he fundamentally changes the role of the American government forever. And in fact, that's going to be something that we'll be covering in a forthcoming talk. I'll be trying to give both sides of that. The question is going to be whether the man on your right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, fundamentally or radically altered the role of the federal government, or whether, by contrast, he preserved the federal government, preventing radical change from taking over, radical changes and a radical takeover, as we saw in so many other countries in the 1930s. And with that cliffhanger of sorts, and with that to look forward to, I want to thank you for making time for this. I hope you find this interesting, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Till then, bye.